By the end of the 15th century, the evidence was already thin. The witnesses were gone. The documents were silent. The truth was unreachable. But the story was just beginning, because history does not require certainty to survive. It requires repetition. Chronicles replaced records. Plays replaced testimony. Character replaced complexity. And slowly, an accusation became a personality. Richard III was no longer a king whose reign could be debated. He became a villain who needed no proof, not because the evidence demanded it, but because the story worked. This episode is not about what happened in the tower. It is about what happened after, when uncertainty was shaped, repeated, and fixed, until history itself forgot the difference between fact and performance. The first version of the past was not a story. It was a record. Medieval chronicles did not aim to entertain. They listed events. They named outcomes. They offered judgment sparingly. Richard III appears in these texts, not as a villain, but as a ruler whose reign ended violently. The language is limited, the detail uneven, the tone restrained. These chronicles were not neutral, but they were constrained by proximity to events. They did not yet know how the story would end. Over time, that distance grew, and with distance came freedom. Later writers were no longer bound by immediate consequence. They could select, condense, emphasize. Complex political moments became simplified explanations. Contradictions were smoothed. Uncertainty was reduced. What began as description shifted toward interpretation. The chronicle did not accuse, but it created a frame that could be expanded, a frame where moral judgment could be inserted. This is the critical transition. History stops recording what happened and starts explaining why it mattered. And explanation requires character. Richard III was gradually transformed from a historical figure into a narrative one. Actions became traits. Outcomes became intentions. Ambiguity became motive. The king was no longer defined by what he did. He was defined by who he was said to be. This is not invention. It is compression. A long, uncertain reign, reduced to a recognizable shape, because stories are easier to remember than records, and characters are easier to repeat than complexity. By the time Shakespeare wrote, the transition was complete. The chronicle had done its work. The stage was ready for a villain who no longer required evidence. Stories do not survive because they are true. They survive because they are repeated. Each retelling removes friction. What was once uncertain becomes familiar. What was once debated becomes assumed. Repetition does not require evidence. It requires agreement. The earliest accusations against Richard III were not fixed. They varied in tone. They shifted in detail. They reflected uncertainty. But as they were copied, summarized, and retold, those variations disappeared. The same phrases returned. The same descriptions hardened. The same conclusions reappeared. Not because new evidence emerged, but because old claims were echoed. This is how memory forms. Repetition creates authority. Without investigation, once a version of events is encountered often enough, It no longer feels like a claim. It feels like background. The mind stops questioning what it recognizes. Chronicles repeated one another. Later writers trusted earlier ones. Plays amplified what texts implied. Each layer borrowed credibility from the last. By the time Shakespeare wrote, the repetition had done its work. He did not invent a villain. He inherited one. The stage did not create the myth. It concentrated it. A complex historical figure was reduced to a set of recognizable traits: ambition, cruelty, deformity, manipulation. Once these traits were fixed, they could be reused, repeated on stage, repeated in print, repeated in memory. At that point, Richard III no longer belonged to history. He belonged to culture. And culture does not ask for proof. It asks for coherence. Repetition provides that coherence. It smooths contradictions. It silences alternatives. It rewards familiarity over accuracy. This is the true power of repetition. Not that it convinces us, but that it teaches us to stop asking. Shakespeare did not create the story. He intensified it. By the late 16th century, the shape of Richard III was already familiar. The accusations existed. The traits were circulating. The outline was set. What Shakespeare added was force. Theater does not argue. It performs, and performance compresses meaning. A play does not ask for patience. It demands recognition. On stage, ambiguity becomes distraction. Complexity becomes delay. Characters must act. Motives must be visible. The audience must understand who they are watching before the scene ends. Shakespeare took a scattered historical memory and gave it a body, voice, gesture, rhythm. He did not need new evidence. He needed coherence. The hunchbacked villain was not a historical claim. It was a dramatic solution. It allowed the audience to feel certainty where history offered doubt. Once performed, that certainty became contagious. The play did not persuade through argument. It persuaded through repetition. Every performance reaffirmed the same image. Every revival reset the memory. Every quotation extended its reach. Richard III became recognizable even to those who knew nothing of his reign. At that point, the character no longer depended on the text. It lived independently in the culture. This is the crucial shift. Theater did not replace history. It overpowered it. Because a performed truth is louder than a documented uncertainty. And once a figure exists as a character, they no longer need to be accurate. They need to be remembered. Shakespeare did not invent a villain. He made one. Unavoidable. At a certain point, memory stops being recalled. It starts being obeyed. When a story is repeated long enough, it no longer feels like interpretation. It feels like fact. This is how authority forms. Without evidence. Not through proof, but through familiarity. Richard III did not become infamous because new information emerged. He became infamous because the same image was encountered again and again and again. Over time, that repetition displaced the archive. The documents became secondary. The doubts became inconvenient. the questions became unnecessary. What mattered was not what could be shown, but what everyone already knew. This is the final transformation. Memory stops serving history and begins to rule it. Once that happens, challenging the story feels disruptive. Revision sounds suspicious. Nuance feels like evasion. The myth defends itself because it is no longer just a narrative. It is a shared certainty. This is why the Tudor myth endured, not because it was proven, but because it was useful, repeatable, and culturally reinforced. By the time historians returned to the records, the authority had already shifted. The question was no longer, what happened? It was, why are we questioning this now? And that is the most powerful form of control over the past. When memory becomes authority, history does not disappear. It becomes conditional, allowed to speak only when it agrees. The Tudor Myth Machine did not erase evidence. It rendered it irrelevant. And once that happens, the past is no longer investigated. It is inherited. This series is not about clearing Richard III. It is about understanding how certainty survives without truth. Because if history can be shaped this way once, it can be shaped this way again. And it often is. The story of Richard III does not end here, because it was never just about him. It was about how a reputation is built, how doubt is erased, and how repetition becomes truth. Once you see the mechanism, you cannot unsee it. The Tudor Myth Machine did not operate once. It operates whenever power controls memory, whenever stories replace records, whenever certainty feels safer than complexity. Richard III was not unique. He was early. Across history, many figures have been remembered, not for what can be proven, but for what was useful to repeat. This series asked how one king became a villain. The next question is harder. How many others did too? And how many myths are we still living inside? Without knowing it,